My name is Clara Johnson. I am 32, a nurse in Columbus, Ohio, and I have spent my life fighting to be seen in a family that only ever praised my brother. For years I told myself the cold stares, the silence, the way my achievements were brushed aside did not matter. But then came the message that broke me. 7 days before my brother's wedding, my mother told me not to come. She claimed I was too sick, that my presence would shame them in front of everyone. In that moment, I felt the final thread snap because I knew it was never about an illness. It was about shutting me out, erasing me, and hiding a truth so dangerous they would rather pretend I did not exist. I was finishing my shift at Riverside General when my phone buzzed in my scrub pocket. I pulled it out tired but relieved the day was almost over until I saw the name on the screen. My mother. Helen. I opened the message, and the words froze me in place. You are not to come to Michael's wedding. You are sick and you will embarrass the family. For a moment, I just stood there in the hallway outside the nurse's station, the hum of monitors and the chatter of colleagues fading. Sick. That was her excuse. I had a cold, nothing more, not enough to keep me from working 12-hour shifts. Yet my mother had taken it and turned it into a weapon, a reason to cut me out of the biggest day in our family's life. The drive home to my little brick house in Upper Arlington felt longer than usual. My chest was tight, the sun glaring through the windshield. Images of last week's dinner at my parents' table flickered in my mind. Helen glowing, as Michael described his latest courtroom victory, her hand squeezing his, as if he alone carried the family name. My father chuckling with approval. I sat across from them, my certificate from the hospital folded in my bag, unmentioned, unnoticed. That memory stung sharper now. I pulled into my driveway and saw Sarah's small face at the window, her 10-year-old smile lighting up when she spotted me. I forced a wave, swallowed the lump in my throat, and walked inside. The house smelled faintly of pasta from the night before. I set my bag down and sat at the kitchen table, the phone still in my hand. My fingers hovered over the screen. I typed a reply, then erased it, typed again, deleted again. The words I wanted to send burned inside me, but I knew they would bounce off her like stones into water. When I finally looked up, Sarah was standing there holding one of her dolls, her head tilted. I smiled, weakly, told her I was fine, and sent her back to play. But inside, I was anything but fine. Later that evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat alone on the couch with only the sound of the refrigerator humming. The text glowed in my mind. Not welcome, not wanted. I opened a new message again, this time to call her out to ask her why. My thumb hovered over send, but I stopped. What would she say? That I was weak, dramatic, selfish, that Michael deserved the spotlight and I would only take away from it. I dropped the phone onto the cushion, pressing my hands to my face. Memories pressed in one after another. Michael wrecking Dad's Buick in high school, and somehow I was scolded for not being there. My science fair ribbon that no one came to see. His basketball jersey that still hangs in the hallway. The pattern had never changed. Michael was the pride. I was the shadow. And now with one cold message, I was being erased completely. I stood and paced the kitchen, restless. My pulse raced as if I were preparing for a confrontation. I wanted to call her, to scream, to demand an explanation. Instead, I gripped the counter and forced myself to breathe. There was no point. She had already decided. She always decided. When the house finally grew still, I slipped into Sarah's room. She was curled under her blanket, her breathing soft, her hair spread over the pillow. I brushed a strand from her cheek, my chest aching. How would I ever explain to her that her grandmother thought we did not belong, that I was being erased from the family portrait she loved to draw? Back in my own room, I lay staring at the ceiling fan. My body was exhausted, but my mind churned. Something about that message gnawed at me. This was not about a cough. It was not about me being unfit to sit in a church pew. It was too sharp, too absolute. It felt like a move in a game I did not know was being played. The question would not leave me. Why was my mother so determined to keep me away? And what exactly was she trying so hard to hide? The next morning, I drove to my parents' house in Upper Arlington. the streets already lined with flags for the upcoming 4th of July. My father's truck was in the driveway, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. If anyone might listen, it would be him. I walked up the familiar porch steps, knocked once, and let myself in. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. My father sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper folded in front of him. He looked up startled, then quickly back down as if bracing for something. I sat across from him, the words tumbling out before I could steady them. "Dad, you know I'm not sick. You know I should be at Michael's wedding." His jaw tightened. He folded the paper with care, avoiding my eyes. "Just do what your mother asks, Clara. Let's not make this worse." The words dropped like stones. I searched his face for compassion for the father who used to patch up my scraped knees, but all I saw was a man who had chosen silence as survival. I pushed back my chair, my pulse racing. If even he would not stand with me, then who would? Back at home, my phone buzzed. Michael's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then answered. His voice was cool, measured. "Clara, it's better if you stay home. Mom's right. Don't make this complicated." For a moment, I could not breathe. This was my brother, the one I had defended through every mistake, the one I had cheered for in every milestone. Now he was shutting the door in my face. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Michael, I only want to be there for you." His pause was brief, then final. "I need peace that day. Please." The line went dead. That night, I sat on the living room couch, tears sliding down my cheeks, before I could stop them. The TV played quietly in the background, forgotten. I buried my face in my hands, but when I lowered them, Sarah was standing in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her big brown eyes were wide, searching. "Why doesn't Grandma want you at Uncle Michael's wedding?" The question pierced deeper than any of my mother's words. I tried to smile, but my lips trembled. "Sometimes people make choices that hurt us," I whispered. She climbed onto the couch and wrapped her small arms around me. I held her tight, wondering how to protect her from a family that had never really protected me. Later that week, Emily dropped by after work, her teacher's tote bag slung over her shoulder. She took one look at my face and shook her head. "Don't tell me you're letting them do this to you." I sighed, my voice hoarse from crying. "Mom says I'm sick, that I'll embarrass them." Emily sat down hard, disbelief flashing in her eyes. "You are not sick. You've worked through worse colds without missing a single shift. This isn't about your health. This is about control." I stared at her, the truth in her tone sending a chill through me. "What are you saying?" She leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "I'm saying they are hiding something from you, and they will do anything to keep you away." Her words hung in the room long after she left. I stood at the window watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes in lazy circles. My chest tightened. If Emily was right, if my mother and brother had conspired to push me aside, then the message was more than cruelty. It was strategy. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, my body heavy, but my mind alive with questions. There had to be a reason beyond a simple cold something that explained why my own family was determined to silence me. And as I lay in bed staring into the dark, a memory flickered of an old document I had once stumbled upon in my parents' house, a memory that suddenly felt less like the past and more like the key to everything. It came back with the clarity of a photograph, a summer afternoon 3 years earlier, when I had stopped by my parents' old house in Cleveland. I was helping them pack up some boxes for the remodel, wandering through rooms that smelled of dust and cedar. In the library, tucked behind a stack of magazines, I had pulled open a drawer and found a manila folder. Inside was a photocopy of a will dated 2016. My eyes had skimmed the lines, hardly believing what I saw. The family home, the savings, the shares in Johnson and Miller Construction, all divided evenly between Michael and me. 50-50. For a moment, I had felt something rare, almost like validation, as if on paper at least I mattered as much as he did. At the time, I slipped the copy back and told myself it was none of my business. My mother's voice floated from the kitchen, telling me not to snoop. I had laughed it off, convincing myself the details of inheritance were far in the future. But now that memory burned with new meaning. If that document existed, why was she insisting Michael alone would inherit everything? What had changed between 2016 and now? I sat up in bed, the sheet falling to my lap, my heart pounding as if I had just discovered it again. The thought of a second will crept into my mind, one I had never seen, one that erased me completely. I pressed my palms together, trying to calm the storm inside me. If such a change had been made, then my mother's excuse about my cold was nothing but a smokescreen to keep me away. The next morning I drove past the old neighborhood, the streets lined with tall maples and familiar brick houses. The Johnson home stood at the corner, freshly painted, but still holding the weight of every childhood memory. I parked a block away and stared at it, remembering the countless evenings spent there, the laughter, the arguments, the way I always felt half present and half invisible. The thought of that will gnawed at me, a silent truth buried in those walls. I called Emily on the drive back to Columbus. Her voice was steady, a lifeline. "Clara, if you saw that will, then it exists somewhere. Documents do not just disappear." My throat tightened. What if they changed it? What if I am not even in it anymore? Emily was quiet for a moment before answering. "Then you need to find out when and why. People do not erase family without a reason." I hung up and sat in my driveway, watching Sarah draw chalk flowers on the sidewalk. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. This was no longer just about attending a wedding. It was about whether I had ever truly belonged in this family, or if I had only been tolerated until I could be written out. That night I pulled out an old box of files I had stored in the basement, mostly papers, from when I helped my parents sort their insurance years ago. I rifled through faded envelopes and receipts, searching for anything that might confirm what I had seen. Nothing concrete appeared, but the memory of that 2016 document would not let me go. I could still see the typewritten lines, my name inked beside Michael's proof, that once, at least on paper, my parents had seen us as equals. Lying awake again, I realized this was the first real thread I had to pull. If I followed it, maybe I would discover why my mother was so desperate to silence me. And maybe, just maybe, I would uncover a betrayal bigger than anything I had been prepared to face. The following afternoon, I sat across from Emily at a small coffee shop near the University District, my hands wrapped tight around a paper cup that had gone cold. I told her about the memory of the will, and how it would not leave me alone. She listened, her brow furrowed, then said quietly that she wanted me to talk with Daniel. He worked in construction management, she reminded me, and he had heard things about the Johnson and Miller Company through colleagues. That evening I drove to their townhouse. Daniel met me at the door, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the smell of sawdust clinging faintly to him. He did not waste time. "Clara, I need you to hear this. Johnson and Miller is preparing paperwork to transfer all company shares into Michael's name." My breath caught the words like a blow to the chest, not a mention of me, not even a courtesy. I sank into their couch, my pulse racing. "Are you certain?" Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "It is moving fast, Clara. Contracts, filings, all drafted without your name." The room seemed to tilt. I remembered the line in the will that had once promised equality, and now here was proof I had been erased. Emily reached for my hand, but I pulled it back, anger rising sharp. "They cannot do this. It is not legal." Before Daniel could answer, the doorbell rang. Emily opened it, and there he was. Richard Hayes, the family's longtime attorney, his silver hair immaculate, his briefcase in hand. He stepped inside without waiting, his eyes cold as glass. "Clara, I understand you have been asking questions." I stood, my voice trembling, but steady. "I have a right to know. My name is on that company." His smile was thin, practiced. "Not anymore. These matters have been settled. You would be wise to focus on your own life." Heat rushed to my face. "Settled? By who?" "By your mother and brother, with proper counsel," he replied, his tone dismissive. "You are not part of the decision." The words slammed into me harder than the text from my mother ever had. I wanted to scream, to demand papers, proof, anything. But Richard closed his briefcase with a snap. "This is a family matter. The law is on their side." Emily's voice cut through the silence. That is not true, and you know it. Daniel stepped forward, his jaw tight. Richard barely glanced at them, his gaze fixed on me with a finality that chilled me. Do not waste your time fighting what cannot be undone. When he left, the air in the room was heavy. I collapsed back onto the couch, my hands trembling. A wall had been raised thick and deliberate not just by my mother, but by the very system meant to protect fairness. I could almost see it brick by brick, cutting me off from what was mine. Daniel placed a folder on the coffee table papers he had pulled from contacts at the courthouse. Look at these. They are moving quickly, but not everything is final yet. There may still be a chance. I leaned forward, scanning the documents, my heart pounding, as I realized there were gaps, signatures pending deals not yet sealed. It was not finished. Not completely. As I left their house that night, the summer air heavy around me, my steps were shaky, but my mind burned with clarity. They thought the wall would stop me, but I had found a crack, and if I pushed hard enough, I might finally see what they were so desperate to keep hidden. The following day, Emily called me at work, her voice low and urgent. "Clara, meet me at the library tonight. I have something." My stomach flipped, and the hours until evening felt endless. When I arrived, she was waiting in a corner study room, a laptop open, papers spread across the table. She looked up, her face pale. "I found it," she whispered. "The will." I sank into the chair, my pulse thundering. Emily slid the document toward me. It was dated April 2022, stamped and notarized, neat as if crafted to erase me cleanly. My eyes scanned line after line, each word heavier than the last. The family home, the savings accounts, the Johnson and Miller construction shares, all reassigned solely to Michael Johnson. My name was gone, like I had never existed. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady the sharp ache. "This is deliberate," I said, my voice breaking. "They erased me." Emily nodded, anger flashing in her eyes. "This is not an oversight. This is strategy." I sat back, staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights humming above me. Every suspicion hardened into truth. The message about my cold was nothing more than camouflage. They had to keep me away from the wedding so no one would question why my name had vanished. That night, after Sarah brushed her teeth and crawled into bed, I tucked her in and kissed her forehead. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, her eyes sleepy but curious. "Grandma called Uncle Michael," she murmured. I froze. "When?" "Earlier," she said softly. I was in the hallway. "Grandma said you cannot be at the wedding. She said if you come, people will start asking about the house and the company." My hands tightened on the blanket. "What else did you hear?" Sarah frowned, trying to remember. "Grandma said everything is Michael's now, and you should stay quiet." Her words sliced through me, sharper than the document had. My mother's cruelty had spilled straight into my daughter's ears. When Sarah drifted off to sleep, I went downstairs, the silence of the house pressing in. I poured a glass of water, but left it untouched on the counter, my mind racing. The evidence was undeniable now. Not just a memory from years ago, not just hints and warnings, but a signed paper and overheard words tying the scheme together. I called Emily, my voice shaking. Sarah heard them talking. "It is worse than I thought." Emily's tone was fierce. "Then you cannot let them get away with this. They have stolen your place." I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of bills and school flyers, the ordinary pieces of my life that I fought to keep afloat. The betrayal felt heavier because it was not just about money or property. It was about erasing me as a daughter, as a sister, as part of the family. Sleep was impossible. I paced the hall, my bare feet whispering against the hardwood floor, my mind replaying every slight, every dismissal. Every time my mother's eyes had skimmed past me as if I were invisible. Now she had put it on paper, carved it into law, and tied it with Michael's name. I stood by the window watching the dark street outside, the lamplight pooling on the sidewalk, where Sarah's chalk flowers still faintly lingered from the afternoon. Something hardened in me. They thought they had silenced me, but what they had done instead was leave a trail. A will leaves signatures, filings, witnesses. If I followed it, I could break their wall. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, pale but steady. For the first time since the message from my mother, I felt something stronger than despair. I felt resolve, and I knew the next step would not just be about uncovering papers, but confronting them with what they had built against me. I barely slept, pacing from one end of the house to the other, as if the movement might quiet the storm in my chest. Each option pressed down on me like a weight I could not shift. If I stayed silent, I would lose everything. If I spoke up, I could ruin Michael's wedding and ignite a war inside the family. Neither path felt safe, but one thing was certain: doing nothing was no longer possible. The next morning I called Emily. She came over with a file Daniel had pulled from the county clerk's office. Her face was set, determined. "Clara, look at this." She spread the papers across my kitchen table. It was an older shareholder document from 2016, still carrying my name alongside Michael's. My pulse jumped. So I had not imagined it. At least once I was recognized. Emily leaned in. "That means you still have legal standing. They cannot just erase you overnight." My hands trembled as I gathered the papers. Relief mingled with rage. They had tried to bury me alive, but the trail was still there. For the next 2 days, I lived in a haze of preparation. I went to the copy shop downtown, ran page after page through the machine, each thud of the copier sounding like a drumbeat in my resolve. I slipped the documents into a black binder and tucked it into my bag, as if it were armor. At night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, speaking the words out loud, practicing the moment when I would no longer be silent. Sometimes my voice cracked. Sometimes anger flared so sharp it startled me. But the more I spoke, the clearer it became. I would not walk into that church as a shadow. I would walk in as the daughter they tried to erase and the sister they tried to silence. On the third evening, Sarah padded into the bathroom where I was rehearsing. She rubbed her eyes, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. "Mom, why are you talking to the mirror?" I knelt down, smoothing her hair. "I am just practicing, sweetie." She pressed her little palm against my cheek. "Do not be sad, Mom. I believe you." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I pulled her close, my throat thick. "Thank you, baby." Those words, simple and pure, felt like fuel in my veins. When she went back to bed, I stood there holding the binder, staring at my reflection. My eyes were swollen, but there was a steadiness in them I had not seen before. I tightened my grip on the folder until my knuckles went white. This was no longer about money or property. It was about dignity, about showing my daughter that silence was not the answer. As the wedding day crept closer, I could feel the tension building like a storm rolling in from the horizon. Every clock tick echoed louder. Every calendar square crossed off carried me closer to the moment when there would be no turning back. On Friday night, I laid out my clothes for Sunday, the plain navy dress I had worn only once to a graduation ceremony. I polished my shoes, pressed the fabric smooth, and set the binder on top of the dresser, where it caught the faint glow of the bedside lamp. My body was tired, but inside a fire burned steady. I crawled into bed, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel powerless. I felt ready, and as I closed my eyes, I saw the church doors swing open and the faces of my family frozen in shock when I stepped forward with the truth in my hands. June 10th arrived with a sky so clear it seemed almost staged. I parked 2 blocks from St. Matthew's Church and sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, until the leather felt hot against my palms. Bells tolled in the distance, and through the open windows, I could already hear music drifting out from the church. Guests in bright dresses and dark suits streamed inside, laughter echoing down the street. My heart thudded, but the black binder on the seat beside me was steady, waiting. I stepped out and walked toward the church doors, the sound of my heels sharp against the stone walkway. My chest tightened as the ushers glanced at me with surprise, their eyes flickering toward the binder clutched to my chest. I pushed past them into the main aisle where rows of polished pews gleamed under the stained glass light. Every head turned. The music faltered, voices rippled like a wave. Helen was near the altar speaking with a cousin when she froze mid-sentence. Her face drained of color, her hand gripping the pew for balance. Michael stood beside the groomsmen, his mouth slackening, his expression caught between anger and fear. I felt the heat of hundreds of eyes on me, but I kept walking, the echo of each step louder than the last. At the front, I turned to face them all. My voice shook at first, but steadied as the words came. This is the will from 2016, signed and witnessed. It divides everything equally between Michael and me. I held up the second document, the one Emily had uncovered. And this is the will from 2022, the one that erased me completely. This is why I was told I was too sick to come today. Not because of a cold, but because they were afraid of the truth. The silence shattered. Guests whispered fiercely, some gasping, others standing in shock. An aunt rose to her feet and demanded to know if it was true. A cousin hissed at Michael, asking what kind of man cheats his own sister. My father sat stiff in the front pew, his face pale, his hands gripping his knees. Helen stepped forward, her voice breaking. "That is a lie. These are not real documents." My hands trembled, but I met her eyes. "Then let everyone see for themselves." Michael moved quickly, reaching for the binder, but I pulled it back. His voice cracked. "You do not know what you are talking about, Clara." The words sounded hollow, rehearsed. Murmurs turned, sharper questions flying from the crowd. How could this happen? Why would she be erased? I looked out at the faces, people who had known me since childhood. Neighbors who remembered me tutoring their kids, relatives who had once praised me for working through nursing school. Their eyes darted between me and Michael, between my mother's trembling hands and the pages I held. The pastor tried to call for order, but the noise surged. Helen's denial grew frantic, her voice climbing in pitch. Michael stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes, the golden sun stripped of polish. I lowered the documents to my side, my pulse steady now. This was never about my health. This was about power, and about burying me alive on paper. My words cut through the noise, and a hush followed the weight of them settling over the pews. Helen turned toward Michael, whispering harshly, but the microphones caught fragments enough for the guests to hear. She said they should have kept me away, that this was exactly what she feared. Gasps rippled, and the room erupted again, louder than before. I stood firm at the front, binder pressed against my chest, watching their empire of secrets unravel in real time. And as the voices rose and the wedding descended into chaos, I knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning they could no longer avoid. The sanctuary buzzed with voices long after I lowered the binder. Guests surged toward the aisles, some demanding explanations, others whispering in disbelief. Helen's face was pale as stone, her mouth opening and closing with no sound that carried. Michael stood rigid near the altar, sweat shining on his forehead, his practiced composure shattered. The pastor tried to restore order, but the murmurs would not stop. My father remained seated in the front pew, his hands gripping the wooden edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. Finally he rose, his voice rough with age but clear enough to cut through the noise. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "I let this family run on silence, and that was my mistake." The guests quieted, stunned by the rare admission. My throat tightened at the words. I had waited my entire life to hear my father acknowledge me, and though it came late, it struck deep. Helen turned sharply toward him, her eyes wide with betrayal. "Robert, not now." But he did not sit down. He looked at me and gave a slow nod as if to say, he finally saw me standing there. It was the smallest of gestures, but it steadied me more than I expected. Richard Hayes appeared at Michael's side, his briefcase clutched like a shield. He muttered something to him, then stepped forward, his tone forced and oily. "This is not the place for legal disputes. These documents cannot be verified here. You are misleading this congregation." Murmurs rose again, and a guest who worked at the courthouse shouted back that forged filings carried prison sentences. The air snapped with tension, and Richard's face flushed crimson. I gathered the binder against me and spoke, my voice even. "I will let the law decide. But the truth is already visible. You tried to erase me, and today everyone saw it. My words carried not as anger, but as fact, and I saw the weight of them settle in the room." Helen's shoulders sagged, Michael's jaw clenched. Richard's eyes darted toward the door. I turned and walked down the aisle. Sarah was waiting near the back with Emily and Daniel, her small face anxious until she saw me. She ran into my arms, and I lifted her, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, grounding myself in what mattered most. Emily's hand squeezed my arm, Daniel's nod firm. We stepped outside into the bright June sunlight, the church bells still ringing faintly above the noise inside. For the first time in years, I felt air fill my lungs without heaviness. The shadow that had followed me through childhood and adulthood, the shadow of being less than, had been ripped away in front of everyone. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer erased. In the days that followed, I contacted an independent attorney in downtown Columbus, handing over the binder, the documents, and Sarah's recollection of the phone call she overheard. He listened carefully, then assured me there was a case to pursue. Fraud, he said, forgery. We will bring it to light. My heart steadied at his words. The fight was not over, but it was shifting to ground where fairness still had a chance. At night, when the house was quiet, I sat on the porch with Sarah curled beside me, her head against my shoulder. Fireflies lit the yard, and the summer air smelled of cut grass. She asked softly if Grandma was still mad. I kissed her hair and whispered that sometimes people do terrible things out of fear, but the truth always finds its way out. She nodded, her small body relaxing against me. Looking back at the church that day, I knew it was more than a ruined wedding. It was the moment their masks slipped and their secrets collapsed. It was the day I took back my voice. They banned me because they feared the truth, but the truth cannot be buried forever. It may take time, it may take courage, but it will always surface. If you have ever been silenced, if you have ever been told you did not belong, know this. Justice can be delayed, but it cannot be denied. Do you believe the truth always comes out in the end? Tell me what you think, because your voice matters too.